Who do you think out of this? Do you think that any of these written interviews qualifies as visionary? Because I would say no.
No,
And
no.
then who do you think are the creationaries and who are the functionaries?
I think Pete Hamill had some creative creationary stuff. Charles Johnson, obviously, in his best writings. James Emanuel has that. Jack Horner was someone who was a high functionary. Someone like a Philip Lopate was very functionary. Desmond Morris. Desmond Morris maybe would come the closest, let's see, just going through, he was number 8 to having a visionary tendency, but it's arguable. LeDuff, no, he's a very good guy. Brad Steiger, I think, did well in writing about unexplained phenomena. Uh, he believes in it, but I think his main value in writing about it is as a chronicler of these silly beliefs. Edward Hoagland, well, he was an atrocity. He was a stuttering old man who sent this atrocious interview because he was pals with Philip Lopate. I remember Lopate wanted to get paid to finish the interview. I'm like, what the fuck are you smoking? And he wanted to be called a novelist, just like Hoagland wanted. No, Lopate wanted to be called a poet. And I even say in there, your poetry is pretty bad. What am I supposed to? This is one of the reasons I've tried to focus on people without and try to avoid their worst stuff is because they cannot take that fucking criticism. Philip Lopate is a ridiculously bad poet. Edward Hoagland, I had read part of his book years ago, his novel was published. He had no creationary ability whatsoever. He was an essayist, a good science essayist. Daniel Wallace was a good, solid writer of a few books, but nothing spectacular. George Dickinson was creationary. Mark Rowlands, I wouldn't put him in the visionary sense. He had some inklings that went beyond just the functionary. Richard Thompson Ford did a book on race that was okay. Berardinelli, James Berardinelli was a good, solid, online critic. Patricia Schroeder, after Hoagland, and down there with Lopate as one of the worst interviews. She's a former congresswoman. I don't know why the fuck she wanted to do the interview. She didn't seem to even want to do it. Lee Papa, a terrible interview. He was a guy who was an asshole who he called himself the rude pundit. And a few people had gotten me to listen to him, so I was like, okay, I think it might have been Alex Sheramet who. No, when was that? It might have been Alex who had said he might be someone to interview. He turned out to be a moron and someone who was just in the academy. Jiwei Tu, certainly creationary, arguably visionary painter. Drew Gardner, good solid photographer, not visionary. Lem Dobbs, very creationary. Grabowska, creationary. Gruden, an interesting philosopher. Then a kid interviewed me. Terrence Witt, he had some interesting stuff. He also appeared in one of my video interviews, but not anything visionary. Brian Switek, Larry Sanger, Jemai Kashio, Gregory Paul, Chris Impey, Peniel Joseph, Ed Goshashevsky, the Godzilla expert. These are all, people who are good in what they were doing, but nothing, great. Matthew Pulowski did a very good documentary on Eyes of the Mothman. One can make an argument, I'd have to see if he ever did fictive films, that he might have some visionary tendency. Then Andrew Neil. I remember Andrew Neil, he was another one who reminded me of Dorian Sagan. I was talking about his grandmother, Alice Neil. He did a documentary on her, and he was a bit pissy because I think he had emailed me or something about whether I thought something about whether I thought that I was a great writer. I said, sure, I'm a better writer than, forget who I mentioned. He got all pissy about it. And I said, well, I can send you the book, and he didn't want to see it or whatnot. But he's one of these people, who's just got this limited view, and they don't want to push themselves. But he reminded me of Dorian Sagan. Then I did a guy named Matt Ogens, Rick Goldsmith. These are more. I did a series with these documentary makers. Then Howard Bloom again gave a very good interview. I don't know if I would put Bloom in the visionary category. I think he has some interesting ideas, and he's certainly a polymath, but I don't think he gets above creationary at best in any of the fields. Stephen Hicks was an interesting guy who did talk about Nietzsche and the Nazis, but he's also an Ayn Randian. And I remember I asked him about, how can you have this interesting take on Nietzsche and then, swallow the pablum of Ayn Rand? And when I asked him a series of questions about Rand that he refused to answer, and it's like, well, you're doing this interview, and about a third of the interview is missing because he didn't want to talk about Ayn Rand, and it's like, I just don't understand that how someone can be so haughty. He said something in an email to me like, "Well, you just don't understand Ayn Rand." It's like, what the fuck is there to not understand about Ayn Rand? She's not exactly a great intellect. And then I did an interview with Bruce Ario, David Dessa, who did a recent Dan Schneider video interview. The last one was with Julianne Spitzmiller, who did a documentary. I think she did the documentary about Shakespeare Behind Bars, I think was her documentary. So there's maybe about 4 or 5 people who might have had some visionary in them. Maybe about a third to a half that had some creationary, and the rest are just people who are experts in this or that field, just on a functionary level.